The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile recruitment office, casting a harsh glare that seemed to expose every flaw, every doubt, every moment of hesitation that Marcus Chen had ever experienced. He sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his sweaty palms leaving marks on the employment documents spread before him, wondering if this was truly the path he wanted to take. At 24, fresh out of college with a degree in business administration that felt as generic as his unremarkable life, he was about to sign papers that would make him employee #47892 at Meridian Corporation, a mid-tier consulting firm that promised stability, benefits, and the kind of predictable future that his parents had always encouraged him to pursue. The recruiter, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile, slid the final contract across the desk. "Just sign here, Mr. Chen, and you'll officially be part of the Meridian family. Starting salary is $45,000 annually, with standard health benefits and 2 weeks paid vacation after your first year." Marcus stared at the document, his pen hovering over the signature line. Around him, the office buzzed with the quiet desperation of other young graduates eagerly signing away pieces of their souls for the promise of financial security. He could hear the soft scratching of pens on paper, the gentle shuffling of feet, the occasional nervous cough. This was it, the moment when he would officially join the ranks of the employed, the responsible, the safe. But something deep within him recoiled at the thought. Was this really what he had spent 4 years studying for? Was this the culmination of all his dreams, all his potential? He thought about the business plans he had sketched in his notebook during boring lectures, the innovative ideas that had kept him awake at night, the burning desire to create something meaningful rather than simply becoming another cog in someone else's machine. The recruiter cleared her throat. "Is everything all right, Mr. Chen? Do you have any questions about the position?" Marcus looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he saw something flicker in her expression, perhaps recognition of his internal struggle, maybe even a flash of envy for someone who still had the luxury of choice. I need a moment to review the terms one more time." "Of course, take your time. Though I should mention that we have several other qualified candidates interested in this position." The subtle pressure was exactly what he expected, and exactly what made his stomach churn. This was how it worked, the systematic reduction of human potential to mere economic units, the careful manipulation of fear and scarcity to ensure compliance. He had watched his older brother David navigate this same path 5 years earlier, had seen how the bright, creative young man who once wrote poetry and dreamed of traveling the world had gradually transformed into someone who spoke only in corporate buzzwords and worried constantly about quarterly reviews. Marcus set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Through the narrow window beside him, he could see the city sprawling beyond, thousands of office buildings filled with millions of people just like him, all trapped in the same cycle of compromise and gradual surrender. The thought made him feel claustrophobic, as if the walls of the recruitment office were slowly closing in around him. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. Probably his mother, calling to ask if he had signed the contract yet. She had been anxiously awaiting this moment for weeks, viewing his employment as validation of her sacrifices, proof that the long hours she had worked as a seamstress to put him through college had been worthwhile. The weight of her expectations pressed down on him like a physical force, adding another layer to the complex web of obligation and fear that seemed to define his life. But then, as his fingers unconsciously traced the edge of the contract, Marcus remembered something his grandfather had told him years ago, during one of their long walks through the old neighborhood. His grandfather, a man who had survived war, poverty, and countless setbacks, had looked at him with eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom and said, "Marcus, the greatest tragedy in life is not failure, it's the slow death of never trying. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." At the time, Marcus had been too young to fully understand what those words meant. But, sitting in that sterile office, surrounded by the quiet desperation of surrendered dreams, he began to grasp their profound significance. His grandfather hadn't been talking about literal destruction, he had been talking about the necessity of killing the parts of oneself that were driven by fear, by the need for approval, by the desire for safety above all else. The recruiter checked her watch and shifted in her seat, clearly growing impatient. Other candidates were waiting in the hallway, hungry for the opportunity that Marcus was hesitating to accept. But, for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt a strange sense of clarity beginning to emerge from the fog of confusion that had surrounded him since graduation. He thought about the countless hours he had spent researching successful entrepreneurs, reading about people who had taken enormous risks to build something meaningful. He remembered the late-night conversations with his college roommate about starting their own company, the detailed business plans they had drafted and, then, abandoned when the reality of student loan payments and parental pressure began to weigh on them. He recalled the moment of pure excitement he had felt when he first conceived of his idea for a sustainable technology platform, and how that excitement had gradually been eroded by well-meaning advisors who insisted that he needed to be realistic about his prospects. What if being realistic was just another word for giving up? What if the voice in his head that kept urging him to take the safe path wasn't wisdom but cowardice? What if his grandfather had been right, and the only way to truly live was to destroy the weak, fearful version of himself that prioritized security over significance? Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. The recruiter looked up at him with surprise, her practiced smile faltering for the first time during their interaction. "Mr. Chen? Have you made your decision?" He looked down at the contract one final time, seeing it not as an opportunity but as a beautifully decorated prison cell, complete with benefits and vacation time. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I can't sign this." The recruiter's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry? Is there an issue with the salary? We might have some room for negotiation." "No, it's not about the money." Marcus gathered his copies of the documents and slipped them into his backpack. "This just isn't the path I want to take. Mr. Chen, I understand that starting a career can be overwhelming, but this is an excellent opportunity for someone with your background. Meridian Corporation has been in business for over 30 years, and we offer excellent job security." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus said, surprising himself with his candor. "I don't want job security. I want to build something meaningful, something that matters. And I can't do that if I'm spending 40 hours a week making other people rich." The recruiter stared at him as if he had just declared his intention to join a circus. Around them, the other candidates glanced up from their paperwork, some with confusion, others with what looked suspiciously like envy. Marcus realized that he was probably the first person in months to walk away from a guaranteed position, and the recognition felt both terrifying and exhilarating. As he walked toward the exit, Marcus felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had suddenly been lifted. The fluorescent lights no longer seemed harsh but merely ordinary, the gray carpet beneath his feet no longer felt like quicksand but simply a pathway leading toward the door. He was unemployed, uncertain, and completely unprepared for what came next, but, for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The elevator ride down to the lobby seemed to take forever, giving him time to process what he had just done. By any conventional measure, he had just made a terrible mistake. He had no job, no immediate prospects, and no clear plan for how he would support himself while pursuing his entrepreneurial dreams. His parents would be devastated, his friends would think he had lost his mind, and his bank account would run dry within a few months. But, as the elevator doors opened and he stepped into the bustling lobby of the corporate building, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, genuine excitement about his future. The weak, fearful part of himself that had been willing to accept mediocrity was already beginning to die, and, in its place, something stronger and more determined was taking root. He pushed through the glass doors and emerged onto the busy sidewalk, where the afternoon sun felt warmer and brighter than it had in months. Around him, the city continued its relentless pace, people hurrying to meetings, vendors selling food from carts, traffic flowing in its predictable patterns. But Marcus was no longer just another face in the crowd. He was someone who had chosen uncertainty over security, potential over safety, authentic struggle over comfortable surrender. As he walked toward the subway station, his phone rang. His mother's number appeared on the screen, and he knew that this conversation would be the first real test of his newfound resolve. He took a deep breath and answered. "Marcus. How did it go? Did you sign the contract?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying with it years of sacrifice, expectation, and love. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, drawing strength from his grandfather's words, from the memory of dreams that had once felt possible, from the growing conviction that there had to be more to life than the slow surrender of everything that made it worth living. "Mom," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to tell you something. I didn't take the job." The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but Marcus didn't try to fill it with explanations or justifications. He had made his choice, and now he would have to live with the consequences. The weak version of himself was already beginning to fade away, and whoever emerged from this transformation would be someone entirely new. Part 2, The Crucible of Transformation. 3 months later, Marcus sat in his cramped studio apartment, surrounded by empty coffee cups, crumpled papers, and the debris of 1,000 failed attempts to bring his vision to life. The romantic notion of entrepreneurship had collided brutally with reality, leaving him bruised, exhausted, and questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. His savings account had dwindled to double digits, his relationship with his parents had grown strained to the breaking point, and the sustainable technology platform that had seemed so clear and achievable in his mind remained nothing more than a collection of incomplete prototypes and rejected pitch decks. The apartment felt smaller each day, its bare walls seeming to close in around him like the physical manifestation of his shrinking options. He had been surviving on instant ramen and peanut butter sandwiches for weeks, had pawned his laptop twice and bought it back with borrowed money, and had grown so tired of rejection emails from potential investors that he had created a separate folder in his inbox labeled Dreams Deferred. The glamorous image of the risk-taking entrepreneur that had inspired him to walk away from Meridian Corporation had been replaced by the harsh reality of someone slowly running out of time, money, and hope. His phone had stopped ringing weeks ago. Friends who had initially expressed admiration for his courage had gradually stopped inviting him to social gatherings, partly because he couldn't afford to participate and partly because his increasingly desperate attempts to recruit them as co-founders or investors had made every conversation uncomfortable. His brother David called occasionally, always with the same message delivered in increasingly blunt terms. It was time to be realistic, time to admit that he had made a mistake, time to start applying for regular jobs before his unemployment gap became too large to explain. But it was his mother's latest voicemail that had pushed him closest to the breaking point. Her voice, usually warm and encouraging, had carried a note of disappointment so profound that it felt like a physical blow. "Marcus, your father and I are worried about you. We love you and we're proud of your ambition, but we can't watch you destroy your future for some dream that might never happen." Mrs. Patterson next door mentioned that her son's accounting firm is hiring. "Maybe it's time to consider that God might be trying to tell you something." The suggestion that his struggles were some kind of divine message urging him toward conformity had sparked a rage so intense that he had thrown his phone against the wall, cracking the screen and immediately regretting the gesture since he couldn't afford to replace it. Now the damaged device lay on his desk like a metaphor for everything else in his life, functional but broken, holding together but clearly not built to last much longer. Marcus stared at his reflection in the darkened window of his apartment, barely recognizing the person looking back at him. The confident young man who had walked out of the recruitment office 3 months earlier had been replaced by someone gaunt and hollow-eyed, someone who looked like he was fighting a war that he was slowly losing. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his hair had grown shaggy from skipping haircuts to save money, and his eyes held the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from too many sleepless nights spent wrestling with the growing suspicion that everyone else might be right. But, even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Marcus found himself thinking again about his grandfather's words: "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." For weeks, he had assumed that the destruction his grandfather had spoken of was metaphorical, the simple act of walking away from a safe job and choosing uncertainty. Now he was beginning to understand that the real destruction had only just begun, that everything he was experiencing was part of a brutal but necessary process of stripping away everything that wasn't essential, everything that wasn't strong enough to survive in the harsh light of authentic challenge. The realization came to him slowly, like a sunrise that begins almost imperceptibly before suddenly illuminating the entire landscape. What if this crushing period of failure and struggle wasn't evidence that he had made a mistake, but proof that he was finally being forged into someone capable of genuine achievement? What if the comfortable, well-fed version of himself that had existed before this ordeal would never have possessed the desperate creativity, the relentless determination, the absolute clarity of purpose that only came from having everything else stripped away? He thought about the stories he had read of successful entrepreneurs, not the sanitized versions presented in business magazines, but the raw, honest accounts of what it actually took to build something from nothing. Almost without exception, they described periods of profound doubt, financial hardship, social isolation, and the gradual burning away of every safety net until only pure will remained. They talked about the necessity of becoming comfortable with discomfort, of learning to thrive in situations that would break most people, of developing an almost supernatural tolerance for uncertainty and rejection. Marcus pulled out a notebook, one of the few luxuries he still allowed himself, and began to write. Not another business plan or marketing strategy, but a brutally honest assessment of what these 3 months had taught him about himself and about the nature of transformation. He wrote about the weakness he had discovered in his character, the desperate need for approval that had made every rejection feel personal, the attachment to comfort that had made every sacrifice feel like a crisis, the fear of failure that had paralyzed him precisely when bold action was most required. But he also wrote about the strength that was beginning to emerge from the wreckage of his former self. The creativity that had blossomed only when conventional resources were no longer available. The resilience that had developed only after being tested beyond what he had previously thought possible. The clarity of vision that had emerged only after every distraction and fallback option had been eliminated. As he wrote, Marcus began to understand that the person he was becoming through this crucible was fundamentally different from the person who had walked into that recruitment office 6 months earlier. That earlier version of himself had been soft, untested, driven more by fantasy than genuine conviction. This new version, forged in the fire of real struggle, possessed something infinitely more valuable than comfort or security. He possessed the unshakable knowledge that he could survive anything, that external circumstances had no power to destroy him as long as he maintained his commitment to the vision that had brought him to this point. His phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, his heart leaped with the irrational hope that it might be an investor who had somehow discovered his work, but when he checked the screen, he saw something entirely different. "Are you the Marcus Chin who walked away from Meridian Corporation? I have a proposition that might interest you. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow?" Elena Vasquez, Iron Wolf Ventures. Marcus stared at the message, reading it several times to make sure he wasn't hallucinating from caffeine withdrawal and sleep deprivation. He had never heard of Elena Vasquez or Iron Wolf Ventures, but something about the directness of the message, the way it referenced his decision at Meridian, made his pulse quicken with a mixture of curiosity and hope. He spent the next hour researching everything he could find about Elena Vasquez online, using the free Wi-Fi at the coffee shop downstairs since his internet had been disconnected the previous week. What he discovered intrigued him. Elena was a former Navy SEAL who had transitioned into venture capital after a career in special operations. Iron Wolf Ventures wasn't a traditional investment firm but something entirely different, a carefully selected group of individuals who were brought together to work on projects that required not just business acumen but genuine courage, creativity, and the ability to thrive under extreme pressure. The more Marcus read about Elena's background, the more he understood why she might have reached out to him. According to several articles, she wasn't interested in funding traditional startups or working with entrepreneurs who were motivated primarily by the promise of quick returns. Instead, she sought out people who demonstrated what she called authentic commitment, the willingness to sacrifice everything comfortable and safe in pursuit of something meaningful and difficult. The next morning, Marcus stood outside the designated coffee shop 15 minutes early, wearing his only clean shirt and carrying a folder containing his most recent business plans and prototypes. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting, but something about the mysterious message and Elena's background had rekindled a spark of excitement that he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since beginning this journey, he sensed that he might be about to encounter someone who truly understood what he was trying to accomplish. Elena Vasquez arrived precisely on time, and Marcus recognized her immediately despite having only seen photos online. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her eyes alert and assessing. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her mid-30s, but there was something about her presence that commanded immediate respect. "Marcus Chen," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip. "Thank you for meeting me on short notice." They found a quiet corner table, and Elena ordered black coffee while Marcus, acutely aware of his dwindling funds, asked for water. If Elena noticed this detail, she gave no indication, but her observant eyes seemed to take in everything: his slightly worn clothing, the determined set of his jaw, the careful way he arranged his materials on the table. "I'll be direct," Elena said without preamble. I've been watching your situation for the past few months. When someone walks away from guaranteed employment to chase an uncertain dream, especially in this economic climate, it catches my attention. I'm interested in understanding what drives that kind of decision. Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment, wondering exactly what Elena had observed about his recent struggles. I'm not sure watching my situation is the most encouraging way to begin this conversation. Elena smiled, and, for the first time since sitting down, her expression softened slightly. Let me clarify. I don't mean surveillance. I mean that people in my network notice when someone chooses principle over security. Your decision at Meridian was mentioned to me by someone who knows your former recruiter. That kind of choice, walking away from safety when you have every practical reason to accept it, tells me something important about your character. What does it tell you? That you understand something most people never learn, that the greatest risk isn't failure, it's the slow death of never fully committing to something worth fighting for. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Those were almost exactly his grandfather's words, spoken by a stranger who couldn't possibly know about that conversation. Where did you hear that phrase? It's something I learned during my military service, though the exact wording comes from an old Mongolian proverb. The principle is central to everything I do now. Iron Wolf Ventures isn't just about funding companies, it's about identifying people who have demonstrated the willingness to transform themselves completely in service of something larger than their personal comfort. Elena leaned forward, her eyes intense and focused. Tell me about these past 3 months. Not the business metrics or market analysis, tell me about the internal process. What has this experience taught you about yourself? The question caught Marcus off guard. He had expected to present his business plan, to make a pitch about market opportunities and competitive advantages. Instead, Elena seemed more interested in the psychological and emotional journey he had undergone. For the next hour, he found himself describing not just the practical challenges of starting a company with no resources, but the deeper transformation he had experienced, the gradual stripping away of his need for approval, his growing comfort with uncertainty, his evolving understanding of what it meant to commit fully to a vision regardless of external validation. As he spoke, Elena listened with an intensity that was almost unsettling. She asked probing questions that forced him to examine his motivations more deeply than he had ever done before, to articulate not just what he wanted to accomplish but why those goals were worth the price he was paying to pursue them. By the time he finished his account, Marcus felt emotionally exhausted but also strangely exhilarated, as if he had just completed some kind of test that he hadn't even known he was taking. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those penetrating eyes. Finally, she spoke. Iron Wolf Ventures is looking for someone to lead a very specific kind of project. It's not a traditional startup opportunity, and it's certainly not safe. The work involves developing technologies that could have significant impact on how we approach some of society's most intractable problems, but it requires someone who can operate effectively in extremely uncertain conditions, who can build teams and solutions without the luxury of conventional support systems. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. The compensation would be substantial if successful, but there are no guarantees. The failure rate is high, and the personal cost can be severe. Most importantly, it would require you to continue the process of transformation you've already begun, to keep destroying the weak parts of yourself until only the essential remains. Marcus felt his heart racing, but his voice remained steady when he responded. What exactly would be required of me? Elena smiled again, but this time it was the expression of someone who had just found exactly what she was looking for. That's the right question. Most people ask about the compensation first, or the likelihood of success. You're asking about the work itself. That tells me you might be ready for what comes next. She reached into her bag and pulled out a simple business card with only a name, phone number, and the image of a wolf silhouette. Take some time to think about what we've discussed. When you're ready to hear the details, and only when you're certain that you want to continue down this path, call that number. But understand this, once you make that call, there's no going back to who you were before. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but the process of that destruction must be completed voluntarily. No one can force you to become who you're capable of becoming. Elena stood to leave, then paused and looked back at him. One more thing, Marcus. Your mother called my office yesterday. Marcus felt his stomach drop. She what? She's worried about you, as any mother would be. She wanted to know if this meeting was legitimate, if there was really an opportunity here, or if someone was trying to take advantage of your desperation. Elena's expression grew serious. I told her that the opportunity was real, but that the greatest danger you face isn't from external threats, it's from the temptation to return to the safety of mediocrity when the transformation process becomes too difficult to bear. With that, Elena Vasquez walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts, a business card that felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, and the growing realization that his journey was about to take a turn that would make everything he had experienced so far seem like preparation for the real challenge ahead. Part 3, The Iron Wolf Awakens. 6 weeks later, Marcus stood at the edge of a cliff in the mountains of Montana, staring down at a valley that would either become the birthplace of something revolutionary or the site of his complete and final failure. Behind him, a converted warehouse buzzed with activity as a team of brilliant, slightly crazy individuals worked 18-hour days to transform theoretical concepts into functioning reality. The sustainable technology platform that had once existed only in his imagination was finally taking shape, but in ways he never could have anticipated during those desperate months in his cramped apartment. The call to Elena had led to this, an invitation to join what she described as an accelerated innovation laboratory where selected individuals were given unprecedented resources and challenged to solve problems that conventional thinking had deemed impossible. But the price of admission had been higher than anything Marcus had initially understood. It wasn't enough to simply work hard or think creatively. The program demanded a complete reconstruction of self, a willingness to abandon every assumption about limitation and impossibility that had been unconsciously absorbed over years of conventional conditioning. The team Elena had assembled was unlike anything Marcus had ever encountered. There was Dr. Sarah Kim, a former NASA engineer who had walked away from a prestigious position to develop revolutionary energy storage systems after her daughter was born with a rare genetic condition that had given her a different perspective on what truly mattered. James Rodriguez, an ex-Marine and self-taught programmer who had lost his leg in Afghanistan and refused to accept traditional definitions of disability, spending 3 years developing prosthetics technology that was years ahead of anything currently available. Maya Patel, a financial prodigy who had rejected offers from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley to focus on creating economic models that could address systemic poverty in developing nations. Each member of the team had a story of radical transformation, of choosing meaning over security, of destroying the weak version of themselves that had been content with conventional success. They shared a common intensity, a burning focus that came from having confronted the fundamental questions of existence and decided that anything less than complete commitment was a betrayal of their potential. The work itself was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his previous entrepreneurial attempts. Rather than endless pitch meetings and investor presentations, the days were filled with hands-on experimentation, rapid prototyping, and the kind of collaborative problem-solving that he had dreamed about but never actually encountered. Elena had secured funding from sources that preferred to remain anonymous, eliminating the usual pressures of quarterly reviews and incremental progress reports. The only requirement was results' real, measurable impact on the problems they had committed to solve. But the intensity of the environment had pushed each team member to their psychological and physical limits. The combination of unlimited resources and enormous expectations created a pressure cooker effect that revealed both the best and worst aspects of each person's character. Marcus had watched 2 brilliant individuals leave the program after suffering what could only be described as nervous breakdowns, unable to handle the sustained intensity of working at the absolute edge of their capabilities for months at a time. The technology they were developing, a combination of advanced materials science, artificial intelligence, and distributed energy systems, had the potential to revolutionize how communities approached sustainability and self-sufficiency. But the real transformation was happening within the team members themselves, as each person was forced to transcend limitations they hadn't even known they possessed. Marcus's role had evolved far beyond what he had initially imagined. While his original vision for a sustainable technology platform provided the foundation, Elena had challenged him to think more systematically about the broader implications of their work. How could technology serve not just as a tool for solving immediate problems, but as a catalyst for helping others undergo their own transformations? How could they create systems that empowered communities to become more resilient, more creative, more capable of thriving under challenging conditions? The questions had forced Marcus to examine his own motivations more deeply than ever before. Was he driven by genuine desire to create positive change, or was he simply seeking the external validation that would prove his decision to reject conventional employment had been justified? Was he building something meaningful, or was he just pursuing a more sophisticated form of ego gratification? The answers had come through the work itself, through the daily process of confronting technical challenges that seemed impossible until they weren't, of collaborating with team members who pushed him to think more rigorously and creatively than he ever had before, of seeing their collective efforts begin to produce results that exceeded what any of them could have accomplished individually. But it was during his most recent conversation with Elena that Marcus began to understand the deeper purpose behind everything they were building. They had been walking along the mountain trail that connected the warehouse to the small town below, discussing the latest test results from their energy storage prototypes, when Elena had suddenly stopped and turned to face him. "Marcus, I need to tell you something about why I really brought you into this program." The seriousness in her voice immediately captured his attention. Over the months of working together, Elena had maintained a certain professional distance, revealing little about her own motivations or the broader context in which their work was taking place. Now, for the first time, she seemed ready to share something more personal. "When I was in the military, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of human potential. We were deployed in a region where local communities had been devastated by years of conflict and economic collapse. But, instead of simply accepting their circumstances, small groups of individuals had begun organizing to rebuild not just their infrastructure, but their entire approach to living. They were creating sustainable systems, developing new forms of governance, finding ways to thrive under conditions that should have broken them." Elena paused, gazing out at the valley below. What struck me wasn't just their practical success, but the transformation that had occurred within the individuals leading these efforts. They had become something more than they were before, more creative, more resilient, more capable of inspiring others to transcend their limitations. They embodied the principle that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. She turned back to Marcus, her eyes intense and focused. "That's when I realized that the most important work wasn't just developing better technology or more efficient systems. It was identifying and cultivating individuals who could serve as catalysts for this kind of transformation in others. The technology we're building here is important, but it's secondary to the larger purpose, creating a network of people who can help humanity evolve beyond its current limitations." The revelation had reframed everything Marcus thought he understood about their work. They weren't just building a company or developing products, they were part of something much larger, a deliberate effort to accelerate human development by identifying individuals capable of transcending conventional limitations and giving them the resources to maximize their impact. Over the following weeks, as their prototypes evolved into functioning systems and their team began preparing for the first real-world implementations, Marcus found himself thinking constantly about the responsibility that came with this understanding. The sustainable technology platform they had developed was indeed revolutionary, capable of providing clean energy, water purification, and food production systems to communities anywhere in the world, regardless of existing infrastructure. But the real innovation wasn't technological, it was social and psychological, designed to empower communities to become more self-sufficient and resilient. The first implementation was scheduled to take place in a remote village in Guatemala, where decades of political instability and economic exploitation had left the population struggling with basic survival. But, rather than simply installing their systems and walking away, the plan called for training local leaders to not only maintain and expand the technology, but to use it as a foundation for broader community transformation. Marcus would be leading the implementation team, a responsibility that both excited and terrified him. Everything he had learned about himself over the past year, all the internal transformation he had undergone, would be tested in real-world conditions with real consequences for real people. The weak version of himself that had once been willing to accept mediocrity was long gone, destroyed through months of voluntary hardship and relentless challenge. What remained was someone he barely recognized, confident without arrogance, determined without rigidity, capable of inspiring others without manipulating them. But it was his final conversation with Elena before departing for Guatemala that crystallized the full significance of his journey. They were standing again at the edge of the cliff, watching the sun set over the valley where so much of his transformation had taken place. "You know," Elena said thoughtfully, "when I first reached out to you, I wasn't certain you would be able to complete the process. Walking away from that job at Meridian was impressive, but it was just the beginning. The real test was whether you could sustain the commitment to growth when the challenges became truly difficult." Marcus nodded, thinking about the countless moments over the past year when he had been tempted to give up, to return to the safety of conventional employment, to accept that perhaps his parents and brother had been right all along. "What made you think I could handle it?" "Something your mother said when she called my office." This surprised Marcus. His relationship with his parents had gradually healed over the months, especially as his work began producing tangible results, but he hadn't realized that his mother had continued to follow his progress so closely. "She told me that when you were 8 years old, you had built an elaborate fort in your backyard. You worked on it every day for weeks, using scrap wood and anything else you could find. Your father kept telling you it would never be sturdy enough to withstand the weather, that you were wasting your time. But you kept working on it, making improvements, solving problems as they arose. Then, one day, a severe storm hit your neighborhood. Trees fell, power lines came down, several houses suffered damage. But your little fort, the one your father said would never last, survived completely intact." Elena smiled at the memory. "Your mother said that watching you work on that fort taught her something important about your character. You weren't just building a structure, you were proving to yourself that you could create something solid and enduring despite everyone's doubts. That's when I knew you might be ready for this program. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but first he has to discover that he has the strength to build something that lasts." As Marcus prepared to leave for Guatemala the next morning, he carried with him not just the technological innovations they had developed, but a completely transformed understanding of his own capabilities and purpose. The journey that had begun in a sterile recruitment office 18 months earlier had led him to this moment, standing at the threshold of work that could genuinely change lives, equipped with skills and inner strength that had been forged through voluntary hardship and relentless growth. The weak version of himself that had once feared uncertainty and craved approval was indeed completely destroyed, replaced by someone capable of thriving in ambiguous situations, of inspiring others to transcend their limitations, of building systems and communities that could endure and flourish regardless of external circumstances. The call of Iron Wolf had changed everything, but not in the way Marcus had initially expected. The real transformation hadn't been about finding a better job or achieving financial success, it had been about discovering who he could become when all the comfortable illusions and safety nets were stripped away. The man who emerged from that crucible was someone who understood that true security came not from external circumstances but from internal strength, not from avoiding challenges but from developing the capacity to thrive under any conditions. As the plane lifted off from Montana, carrying Marcus toward his new assignment in Guatemala, he thought once more about his grandfather's words, "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." Now he finally understood what those words really meant. They weren't about achieving some final state of invulnerability, they were about embracing the ongoing process of growth and transformation that enabled a person to meet any challenge with confidence, creativity, and genuine strength. The new recruit who had once hesitated over a simple employment contract was gone forever. In his place was someone ready to help others discover their own capacity for transformation, someone who understood that the greatest adventures began not with certainty but with the courage to destroy everything that was weak and build something stronger in its place. The Iron Wolf had awakened, and the real work was just beginning.